The discipline of silence in a loud world. There's a particular kind of suffering that belongs only to our time. It's not the suffering of scarcity or survival, but the suffering of constant invasion. Every ping, every notification, every voice demanding your attention creates a fracture in your consciousness. You wake up to the noise, you work within the noise, you fall asleep scrolling through the noise, and somewhere beneath all of it, there's a version of you that hasn't spoken in years. Not because you don't have a voice, but because you've forgotten how to hear it. The ancient Stoics called this the loss of the inner citadel, the fortress of self that must be defended at all costs. Today we're going to explore what happens when a man rediscovers silence, and why that rediscovery might be the most radical act of resistance available to you. His name was David, and for most of his adult life, he had been extraordinarily successful by every conventional measure. He worked in finance, lived in a major city, and had cultivated the kind of social presence that made him seem perpetually engaged, perpetually relevant. His mornings began with market news and ended with late-night messages to colleagues across time zones. He prided himself on being responsive, on being plugged in, on never missing an opportunity or a conversation. But there was something else happening beneath the surface, something he couldn't quite name. He would find himself in meetings, nodding along to discussions, and realize he hadn't actually heard a word anyone said. He would be at dinner with friends, laughing at the right moments, and feel like he was watching himself from somewhere far away. The noise had become so constant that he no longer noticed it, and in not noticing it, he had stopped noticing himself. Chapter 1. The Breaking Point. The collapse came quietly, as these things often do. David was sitting in his apartment on a Sunday afternoon, phone in hand, scrolling through nothing in particular. He had nowhere to be, no urgent task demanding his attention, and yet he felt a kind of panic rising in his chest. The silence of the room was unbearable. He turned on music, then a podcast, then the television, layering sound upon sound until the emptiness was covered. And then, for reasons he still couldn't explain, he stopped. He turned it all off. He sat in the quiet and felt, for the first time in years, the full weight of his own absence. Carl Jung once wrote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. David realized in that moment that he had been running from something, not toward anything. The noise wasn't a symptom of a full life. It was a defense mechanism against an empty one. He began to research, diving into philosophy and psychology with the same intensity he'd once brought to quarterly earnings reports. He read about the Desert Fathers, early Christian monks who retreated into the Egyptian wilderness to confront what they called Acedia, the Noonday Demon of restlessness and despair. He studied the psychoanalytic concept of the false self, the persona we construct to meet external demands while our authentic self atrophies in isolation. He learned about Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, the idea that meaning is found not in comfort or distraction, but in confronting the unavoidable suffering of existence with purpose and dignity. All of these traditions, separated by centuries and continents, pointed to the same fundamental truth. Silence is not the absence of noise, it is the presence of self, and the self can only emerge when the static is removed. David made a decision that seemed almost absurd to his friends and colleagues. He would practice silence, not as a hobby or a weekend retreat, but as a foundational discipline. He started small, committing to 1 hour each morning without his phone, without music, without any input at all. He would sit with a cup of coffee and simply be. The first week was excruciating. His mind raced, his body fidgeted, and every instinct screamed at him to fill the void. But he persisted. He learned to observe the patterns of his own thoughts without engaging them, to let the noise of his inner world rise and fall without reacting. What he discovered was startling. Most of what he believed to be his personality, his preferences, his very identity, was nothing more than accumulated reactions to external stimuli. Stripped of the noise, he hardly recognized himself, and that recognition, painful as it was, became the first step towards something real. Chapter 2. The Shadow Speaks. As the weeks passed, something unexpected began to happen. In the silence, David started hearing things he had spent years suppressing. Memories surfaced, sharp and uninvited. a childhood marked by a father who valued achievement above all else, a pattern of relationships where he performed the role of partner without ever feeling truly seen, a deep, aching loneliness that no amount of social engagement could touch. Jung called this the shadow, the repository of everything we reject about ourselves, the parts we deem unacceptable and exile to the unconscious. The shadow doesn't disappear when ignored. It festers, it distorts, it controls us from the darkness. Silence is the medium through which the shadow finally gets to speak. David realized that his addiction to noise had been a strategy to avoid this encounter. Every notification was a small reprieve from the work of self-examination. Every conversation was a chance to reinforce the constructed self and keep the real self locked away. But now, sitting alone in his apartment each morning, he had no choice but to listen. The feelings that arose were not comfortable. There was rage directed at the years he'd lost chasing someone else's definition of success. There was grief for the relationships he'd let wither because he was too busy performing to be present. There was shame for the ways he'd abandoned himself over and over in the name of fitting in. This is the paradox of silence. It feels like retreat, but it's actually confrontation. It's where you meet the parts of yourself you've been running from. The psychologist James Hollis writes that the second half of life is about recovering the unlived life, the paths not taken, the selves not expressed. David was beginning to understand what that meant. He had constructed an entire existence around external validation, and now that structure was crumbling. The question was whether he had the courage to let it fall completely. He thought about Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return, the thought experiment that asks, if you had to live this exact life over and over for eternity, would you say yes? David knew his answer was no. And that knowledge, dark as it was, contained within it the seed of transformation. Because if you can't say yes to the life you're living, you have both the responsibility and the freedom to change it. Chapter 3. The Discipline of Elimination. David began to see silence not as an absence, but as a form of discernment. Silence reveals what matters by showing you what doesn't. He started applying this principle systematically to his life. He looked at his calendar and saw that most of his commitments were obligations he'd agreed to out of guilt or habit, not genuine desire. He began saying no, not aggressively, but with a calm finality that surprised even him. He evaluated his relationships and realized that many of them were transactional, built on mutual performance rather than mutual understanding. He started spending less time with people who required him to be someone he wasn't, and more time alone, or with the few who accepted him as he was. This wasn't antisocial, it was selective. It was the recognition that attention is finite and sacred, and where you place it determines who you become. He also turned his attention to his environment. The apartment that had once been a showcase of success now felt like a museum of distractions. He removed the television from his living room. He deleted social media apps from his phone. He established a rule: no devices in the bedroom, no screens for the first hour after waking or the last hour before sleep. These changes were met with resistance, both internal and external. Friends asked if he was okay, if something was wrong. Colleagues joked about him becoming a hermit. But David felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt coherent. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want, but the ability to want only what is within your control. David was learning to distinguish between what he could control, his own attention and response, and what he couldn't, the entire churning machinery of the world's demands. The discipline of elimination extended to his inner life as well. He noticed how much mental energy he spent on hypothetical scenarios, on conversations that hadn't happened, on outcomes he couldn't influence. He began practicing what the Buddhists call non-attachment, not as cold detachment, but as a refusal to let his peace depend on external circumstances. When anxiety arose, he didn't try to fix it or flee from it. He sat with it in silence, observing it like a weather pattern passing through, and gradually it lost its power. This is the paradox of acceptance. The more you resist your own suffering, the more it persists. The more you meet it with silence and presence, the more it transforms. David was learning that discipline is not about adding more, achieving more, becoming more. It's about removing everything that isn't essential until only the truth remains. Chapter 4. The Power of Presence. 6 months into his practice, David noticed something remarkable. He was becoming more effective, not despite the silence, but because of it. At work, while others drowned in information, he could see patterns clearly. He spoke less in meetings, but when he did speak, people listened. He had stopped trying to prove himself, and paradoxically, his value became undeniable. In his personal life, the few relationships he'd kept deepened in ways he hadn't thought possible. He was no longer performing connection. He was present for it. When he sat across from someone, he was actually there, not planning his next response or checking his phone under the table. People felt the difference, even if they couldn't name it. This is the power that silence cultivates. Presence. Not the performance of being present, but the actual state of being fully here, fully now. The philosopher Martin Heidegger called this authentic being, the mode of existence where you are not lost in the anonymous chatter of the crowd, but grounded in your own singular experience. David was learning that most people go through life in a state of profound absence, physically here, but mentally scattered across 1,000 fragmented concerns. Silence was teaching him to gather himself, to consolidate his energy, to show up as a unified whole rather than a collection of competing impulses. And that unified presence had a gravity to it. It changed rooms, it changed conversations, it changed outcomes. But there was a cost. David found himself increasingly alienated from the mainstream pace of life. The constant urgency that drove most people seemed absurd to him now. The need to have an opinion on everything, to be perpetually entertained, to fill every gap with noise. It all felt like a kind of madness. He understood why mystics and philosophers throughout history had often lived on the margins of society. Once you've tasted silence, the world's noise becomes unbearable. Once you've found your center, the endless displacement and distraction looks like what it is, a mass forgetting, a collective abandonment of self. David didn't judge it, but he also couldn't participate in it anymore. He had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. Chapter 5. The Return. The question became how to live in the world without being consumed by it. David thought about the Zen concept of being in the world, but not of it, moving through society while maintaining an inner stillness that no external chaos can disturb. He realized that silence wasn't about escaping life, but about engaging with it from a position of strength rather than reactivity. He continued his morning practice, expanded it even, adding meditation and journaling to his routine. But he also re-engaged with certain aspects of the world he'd stepped back from, this time with clear boundaries and intentionality. He returned to work with a new negotiation. He would contribute fully during certain hours, but the rest of his time was his own, non-negotiable. He reconnected with old friends, but on different terms. He stopped performing the role of the successful financier and instead showed up as himself, complete with uncertainties and questions. Some relationships couldn't survive that shift, and he let them go without bitterness. But others transformed into something deeper, more honest, more alive. He even began to write, not for publication or recognition, but as a way of processing what he was learning. The writing was another form of silence, a conversation with himself that required no audience. In all of this, David was practicing what the existentialists called authentic existence, living from the inside out rather than the outside in, making choices based on his own values rather than inherited scripts. What he discovered was that silence is not a destination, but a practice, a discipline that must be renewed daily. The world will always be loud, the demands will always be there, the distractions will always beckon. Silence is the choice to return, again and again, to the inner citadel, to the space where you are not fragmented by 1,000 inputs, but whole, present, and real. David understood now that this was not a luxury or a retreat from responsibility. It was the foundation of all genuine responsibility, because you cannot give what you do not have. You cannot be present for others if you are absent from yourself. You cannot act with integrity if you don't know who you are beneath the noise. Chapter 6. The Quiet Revolution. There's a story from the Desert Fathers about a monk who was asked by a visitor what he and his fellow monks did all day in the wilderness. The monk replied, "We fall and we get up. We fall and we get up. We fall and we get up." David thought about this often. The practice of silence was not about achieving some permanent state of enlightenment. It was about the daily choice to return to yourself, even after being swept away by the currents of the world. It was about recognizing when you've lost your center and having the discipline to find it again. This is what separates those who transform from those who merely talk about transformation. The willingness to fall and get up again and again, without drama or self-pity. David began to see his life as a kind of experiment in resistance. Not resistance to the world itself, but to the world's claim on his inner life. He resisted the demand to be constantly available, constantly productive, constantly stimulated. He resisted the pressure to fill every moment with content, every silence with sound. He resisted the assumption that a life of depth and meaning must look a certain way from the outside. This resistance was quiet, almost invisible to others, but it was absolute. And in that absoluteness, David found a freedom he had never known. The freedom to be exactly who he was, to live exactly as he chose, to answer to no authority but his own carefully examined conscience. The irony was that this seemingly solitary practice made him more connected, not less, because he was no longer seeking connection as he escaped from himself. He could offer genuine connection when it arose. Because he was no longer afraid of silence, he could tolerate the silence that real intimacy requires, the pauses, the unspoken understanding, the comfort of shared presence without performance. His relationships became fewer, but infinitely richer. His work became more focused, but infinitely more meaningful. His life became smaller in scope, but larger in depth. This is the trade that few are willing to make. The world offers breadth, noise, constant novelty. Silence offers depth, clarity, enduring presence. You cannot have both. You must choose. If you're watching this, you felt it. The exhaustion of being perpetually online, perpetually available, perpetually stimulated. You've sensed that something essential is being lost in the noise, some part of yourself that can only emerge in silence. What David discovered, and what the wisdom traditions have taught for millennia, is that this intuition is correct. You are losing yourself. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, imperceptibly, one distraction at a time. The discipline of silence is the practice of stopping that loss, of turning inward when everything pulls you outward, of defending the inner citadel when the world demands total access. This is not about becoming a monk or abandoning your responsibilities. It's about recognizing that beneath every external demand is a choice. You can choose to respond or not respond. You can choose to engage or create space. You can choose to fill the silence with noise or sit with it until something real emerges. The world will call this impractical, antisocial, even selfish. But the world is wrong. The most generous thing you can do is become fully yourself. The most responsible thing you can do is reclaim your attention from those who would colonize it. The most radical act available to you is to be silent in a loud world and discover, in that silence, who you actually are. David still lives in the same city, still works in the same field, still navigates the same chaotic world we all inhabit. But he moves through it differently now. He carries with him a stillness that cannot be shaken by external circumstance. He has learned that silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of self. And once you find that presence, once you taste that stillness, no amount of noise can take it from you. The discipline is simple. Begin. Sit in silence. Let the noise fall away. Meet yourself in the space that remains. Fall and get up. Fall and get up. Fall and get up. This is the work. This is the way. This is how you become real in a world of echoes.